So I recently worked to restore and colour the 26 US presidents whose likenesses were only photographed in black and white. In this video, I'm going to explain why I decided to do this rather time-consuming task. I'll also talk about the restoration and colorisation processes from a technical point of view, and give my overall thoughts on the entire project and what I learnt from it. So I like to try and work on a fairly broad range of photographs for colorisation. I'm therefore always glad to receive suggestions on which topics or people I should cover in the future. I noticed that I had been receiving multiple requests to colorise an image of Abraham Lincoln, so I did. The completed picture was quite well received online, getting over 12,000 upvotes on Reddit for example. Now, as much as I love upvotes, who doesn't, it was actually the comments both on Reddit and elsewhere which were the most rewarding and informative part of posting that image. Multiple times I received basically the same comment, saying that this colorisation had allowed the commenters to see Lincoln as a fully real human for the first time. Now that thought really stuck with me, and also made me realise just how many important historical people have now become no more than a monochromatic face in a history book. For the most part, I've typically tried to focus on colouring the more social history side of history, as I felt everyday life was generally less well highlighted than major historical persons and events. That Lincoln picture taught me that there's actually a real merit to trying to make these more immediately significant historical people more relatable to a modern audience. This was the main driving force behind my decision to colour every single president. So I'm not going to go through every single president I worked on in this video, partially because the video would be incredibly long, also because I'd repeat myself a lot in terms of my working processes, and finally because I already made a video where I showed off all the final images. What I will do is take you through a representative selection of those I worked on, which between them will allow me to cover all the various challenges I ran into throughout the project. John Quincy Adams was the 6th President of the United States. He was also the first of America's family-based dynastic presidents, being the son of the 2nd President, John Adams. Most notably for me, however, he was the first president to be photographed. Earlier photographs such as this one, which was created in 1843, have the potential to have become quite badly damaged over time. While every photograph I worked on required at least some restoration, the earlier ones certainly presented the largest repair problems to solve. The intention that I had to put all these pictures together in a final video also made the fact that most of the earlier ones were heavily damaged quite personally discouraging. In restoring pictures, there's only ever so much that you can do to repair them, certainly while retaining original details. So when restoring heavily damaged photographs, they're never going to look as clean as the photographs which started in perfect original condition do. I always knew that the first 5 presidents in my completed video were going to be paintings which were bright, clean and perfectly presented. I therefore also knew that for someone watching the video, they would move from a finely detailed painting of the 5th US President James Monroe to my best attempt at restoring this photograph of John Quincy Adams, which would never be able to compare to it visually due to just how much damage the photograph had incurred over time. As it turns out, I'm reasonably happy with this final restoration and colorisation. While I don't feel it holds up as well as some of the presidents restored from glass plate negatives for example, I think I was able to achieve my primary goal of trying to bridge the gap between when this picture was taken in the 1800s and the present day. As much as I had issues with this restoration, compared to John Quincy Adams' immediate successor as president, this photograph was remarkably simple to work with. So this photographic daguerreotype of Andrew Jackson was the most damaged picture I've ever had to restore. Now, I didn't have to use this picture. Another photograph was taken at this same photographic session, and this other one is admittedly in better condition. Unfortunately, since my goal for this project was first and foremost to help people connect with these historical faces, I wanted the presidents to be posed facing the camera, and therefore audience, and not them sitting in a side profile. For that reason, I was rather stuck with using this incredibly damaged, yet front-facing, picture as the base for my Andrew Jackson restoration. Initially, I tried to restore it using much the same techniques as I would with any photograph, primarily using Photoshop's healing brush tools. I quickly realised, however, that in doing so, I would be pretty much just painting entirely new and non-accurate detail in. Photoshop's healing brush tools rely on sampling information from a non-damaged part of the image, and in the case of this image, non-damaged parts barely exist. Now, just when I was about to give up on this photograph and go with the side profile view instead, something occurred to me. While I'd been searching for photographs of Andrew Jackson, I also discovered this engraving, which was created using the original, pre-damaged photograph for reference. Upon overlaying the corresponding engraving to my damaged photograph, I discovered that this reproduction was remarkably faithful and would be a good image source for replacing damaged elements of the photograph. For where the engraver had taken some creative license, mostly to make Andrew Jackson appear less old it seems, I used the liquify tool in Photoshop to make the engraved features better match the faint details still visible in the damaged photograph. Obviously I can't be sure that the details that I used from the engraving, now missing in the photograph, are 100% correct. That being said, the reproduction engraving of this photograph was created by someone who saw and copied the non-damaged version, who likely held it in their hand, so it's about as good a source as it will be possible to find for how it originally looked. For me, I'm always really fascinated by historically produced reproductions which exist in a better condition to the original. It's like the Roman statues which were reproduced from plaster casts during the Victorian age and sent to the museums around the world. Now the originals which were stuck outside have been damaged by acid rain, and the plaster cast reproductions are in some ways the more historically accurate version, as they retain details which the true carved versions have since lost. It raises the question of what is a historical document, the physical object itself, or the information it's transmitting to the viewer. I'm quite happy with how this picture looks now. It's not quite a photograph anymore, or an engraving, but I also feel it may be one of the most accurate depictions of Andrew Jackson's true likeness that now exists. Let's jump ahead now to the 18th President, Ulysses S Grant, and from some really tough restorations to a surprisingly easy one. Sometimes you can't really be sure just how well you'll be able to restore a photograph until you actually start. Despite really liking this picture from a composition and expression point of view, I was quite worried that it appeared to be overexposed. Being a glass negative, and not either a daguerreotype or a print, I knew that there would be quite a lot of potential to adjust the contrast in this image. However, I was genuinely really shocked at just how much detail was stored within this negative. From a colouring point of view, it's really essential to try and bring as much detail and contrast out in your black and white image as possible before you even start colouring. The major difference between real life and photography, in my opinion, is generally higher dynamic range, which occurs in real life, but less so in photography. Dynamic range is broadly the potential levels of contrast an image can have. Even if you're not familiar with high dynamic range as a concept, you'll have likely seen HDR images produced by cameras which show extra levels of detail within a photograph. Now, photographers usually avoid HDR for portraits as it highlights flaws on people's skin, and broadly speaking, portraits are usually meant to be flattering. However, it's the removal of these flaws, I feel, which makes someone a portrait and not a person. Again, my purpose and method when colouring pictures is always to try and remove some of the artificial nature of the photography session, and make the sitter into the person they were outside of the photography studio. Therefore, I always adjust my contrast to try and bring out more of those freckles, hair follicles and other small human imperfections to help people more easily make a connection with these very human people from the past. In terms of the 26th US President, Theodore Roosevelt, I don't really have much to say about the actual process of restoring and colouring the picture itself, as it was fairly straightforward, and I've got videos which explain my wider process in far more depth than I'll be able to do so here. What I will talk about, however, is the process that I nearly always have to go through after I've seemingly completed one of these images, that of making it visually appealing for every person who views it. So I think one of the most important things I ever learnt about colourisation was to double check my final piece of work on multiple screens. What looks good backlit on a modern mobile phone might look terrible when viewed on an older television, for example. Pretty much every person viewing my images will be doing so under different conditions, sometimes ones far from ideal. So to take you behind the scenes for a second, I use a 2-monitor setup with my computer. One of those monitors is an actual computer screen, the other is a small TV which I also use for video games and such. The television was never intended to be used as I use it, often switched on for hours upon hours while I'm using my computer, before going into entertainment use in the evenings. I've been using it this way for nearly a decade pretty regularly, and the contrast, while never identical to the dedicated computer screen, is gradually moving further away as the screen wears out. However, for the purposes of colorisation, this worn-out TV is actually pretty ideal. Colorisations on my TV screen are more yellow in colour, and the contrast is much more severe. This TV, therefore, is increasingly standing in as a tool for judging the potential worst-case scenario for my work to be viewed by someone. I never purposefully make adjustments to my work to cater for damaged screens, as I assume they'll be a very small part of my audience. That being said, if a small brightness adjustment takes nothing away from how my image looks on a good screen, but vastly improves its appearance on a less ideal screen, obviously I'll make that change. In this case, I made 10 different revision versions of this image purely to review on both my dual monitor setup and my mobile phone. For this image, I think I spent almost as much time making tweaks and checking new versions of it as I spent originally colouring it. Finally, let's finish with President 27, William Howard Taft. So I feel this picture probably best represents the entire process involved with colorisation. So the first stage is always to select your image. Unlike with Andrew Jackson, I had multiple images to pick from where William Howard Taft's face was clearly visible. I decided to go with this picture due to it being a full-length body portrait. William Howard Taft is best remembered for his large stature. This was the same during his life, and he was even nicknamed Big Bill by the press of the time. For that reason, much like choosing to represent President and formerly General Ulysses S Grant in his military uniform, I wanted to show Taft as he is and was typically viewed. Next up was the restoration phase, which involved both repairing some cracks to the negative and generally removing a lot of dust and scratches. What glass negatives tend to gain in terms of producing an image with a rich contrast, they tend to lose in just how vulnerable to damage they are. At the end of the restoration stage, I noticed that the books in the bookcase had backwards titles, and the image therefore had to be flipped. The colouring process for this image was by far the most complicated of any in this presidential project. The issue with having this particular full-length portrait is that there are a lot of other objects in the scene which also had to be coloured. There are telephones, inkwells, books, a bookcase, a flag, and all of them required multiple layers of base colours, shadows and highlights to colour them accurately. My favourite detail in this picture is this, what appears to be, reflector used to bounce some of the natural sunlight onto Taft's shadow side. It's unusual to see old photographic equipment be actually captured within the photograph. I assume this was intended to be cropped out of the final printed image, but it's obviously still intact on the raw negative. The final stage of colouring this image, as it is with most images, is to recreate any lighting effects which would have been in the original setting. So in this case we have a large window shining light onto Taft, so I made that light slightly yellow. I also added a contrasting purple to the darker shadow areas of the image away from the window light. If you're interested in learning more about colorisation or restoration, I have in-depth tutorials for doing both in Photoshop on my channel. It is worth saying that despite this project being primarily about restoring and colouring the black and white photographic presidents, a lot of the colour images I used also required at least some minor repair work. This image of the 38th president, Gerald Ford for example, required quite a lot of repairs as you can see. So that was a run through of the process involved with restoring and colouring the US presidents. I found this project really rewarding, but not necessarily for the reasons I thought I would. History is a subject which I never had much skill with learning before. I typically fare better with things such as software, where I have to learn by seeing and then doing, rather than by purely remembering things. By spending so long with this project, 100 hours at lowest estimate with additional time spent writing about these men, I really found myself picking up a lot of historical information which I would never have learned through more traditional means. For me, it was nice to realise that it wasn't my inability to learn about history and retain the information, but more about the way I had been trying to learn it before. I can only imagine this may be the case for other subjects I've struggled with picking up in the past. I look forward to more in-depth historical projects like this and adding to my own knowledge of history in the process. I really hope this project will also benefit others, but even if it never gains much traction, I feel it was useful for me, and I move on to further projects more confident I'll be able to both complete them and also learn from them than ever before. If you'd like to see all of the completed presidential pictures, please check out my original video. I will leave some links in the description, including a link to an interview I did on the project for History Coloured. As mentioned earlier, if you have any suggestions for what kind of videos you'd like to see from me, please let me know in the comments. Also, if you have any questions about this project which I've not covered, please feel free to leave them below also. Thanks for watching.